So today we will be talking about the wetlands of Alaska, their importance and economic potential that they bring to the state of Alaska.
So our problem is basically asking how we can best protect the land and the culture of the people who live in it, while also allowing for development economically of Alaska and their economy. Now, the importance of this is that it analyzes the importance of wetlands, its benefits to people, and its handicaps that it gives as well. Most of the state of Alaska is covered in wetlands, and even more is federally owned as federal land. This makes it important to find a solution to this that's both culturally, environmentally, and economically sound.
So solution number one is to impose restrictions on oil companies such as drill limits, time limits, and noise limits to protect wildlife and the land itself for subsistence hunting and fishing, which is the native use of the land. And I have a quote by the Anchorage Daily News. Done right, exploration and development harm neither the caribou nor the ways of the people who depend on them. So some pros of this plan. It can curb environmental damage of the land, while not necessarily removing all of it. It can stop some environmental damage and cultural damage. And it can create a debate between different parties to propose solutions to the problem. Some cons, some people might say it's not enough to protect the environment. One side may be left out of debates and solutions, which has happened before. For instance, maybe conservationists might be left out of debate. And economic impact. 90% of Alaska's revenue is from the oil industry. And if we impose restrictions such as time limits, that could reduce oil production, which would in turn reduce revenue for the state. And some limitations of this plan. The time. Time for debating laws generally takes a long time. It can take months or even years to get the solution on the ground and running. And oil companies may just ignore trees or look elsewhere for oil for different states and different land areas that aren't affected by laws. And it won't cover all projects since some landowners might not put restrictions in place on oil companies. Some implications: argumentation between sides could create debate and could take a long time. And environmental damage, because the restrictions, while reducing environmental damage, wouldn't completely eliminate it.
So our second solution, which is a little bit more serious or different than what Will said, is completely banning oiling and deforestation in Alaskan wetlands. So some obvious pros to this is that the conservation of animals would greatly be improved upon and wildlife would thrive. But some cons to this are that oil corporations would be furious about this. They would try to lobby off this bill. Business could go down, and the argument, what could have been, would be used a lot by the opposition and could sway some people. The limitations are, of course, the legislation. This could take months or years to get passed and into action just because all the lobbying that these oil corporations will do. The implications, of course, are the oil companies and Alaska's future. Which should be noted, according to the Anchorage Daily News, there are 9% less jobs in petroleum in the 2010s than there were in the 90s. And I'm not sure if Jacob mentioned this earlier, but 43% of Alaska are wetlands.
Now, for our third solution, we're talking about reform of two of the legislation bills that cover the rights of the indigenous and how we can change them to better protect the environment in places that are important to the culture of the people, while also giving more room for development as it would rid some protections on less important land. I'd like to start with a quote. The federal subsistence management program fails to incorporate Alaska Native traditional knowledge management practices, and customs into the implementation and regulation of the subsistence hunting. So basically these legislational bills, they cover how the indigenous get their food from the land, but they don't cover their traditions and how they live. Now, some of the pros to reforming this in order to basically better understand how the indigenous use the land is that it would allow for development in less culturally important land. This would really help to allow for more economic growth. In doing so, we keep the important land to the indigenous as well, so we are keeping the indigenous happy and healthy. When done well and by law, it is better enforced instead of just saying, oh, well, we shouldn't do this. It's by law, so people can actually enforce it. The cons of this is that it would rid protection over land that is not as culturally important, but could be environmentally important. So it could be essential to include environmental scientists in choosing the land that is the most important to keep and the land that can be better used for development. The limitations to this is that law takes a lot of time, just like all of our other solutions, and the public and the politicians would all maybe disagree on how they can best implement something like this. The other limitation is that we don't know exactly who would define what these traditional uses are. There's many different tribes and they all do things differently. So who defines what is important could be a problem and hard to actually implement this kind of reform. An implication of this is that it could provide negative environmental effects to the places that aren't as protected. But it could help the places that aren't, because they're better protected by culture. Now, we'd like to begin with how we're choosing our third solution, and in doing so, we say that law reform can help the indigenous, as this is what they want. They want their tradition to be protected, and a lot of the legislation doesn't fully protect that. And this solution covers that really well.
Yeah, and this can protect the oil industry as well. As I said, 90% of the state's revenue comes from the oil industry. I have a quote by the Alaska Oil and Gas Association. It says the petroleum industry supports 1/3 of Alaskan jobs, generating 110,000 jobs throughout the state. It is a very large part of their economy, and this plan would preserve that part of the economy.
Because of the protections put in, because of cultural reasons, the land protected will only be protected to people.
So we find this is the best compromise.
Terrific.